lonely rancher bought a deaf girl sold by her drunk father, then realized she heard. The midday sun in rural Texas was neither cruel nor kind. It just hung there, steady, heavy, warming the dust that rose from the red clay road and clung to boots, breaths, and memory. It was the kind of day that felt stuck in time, where nothing urgent happened and no one expected it to. Silas had come to the livestock market out of habit more than need. He wasn't looking to buy. Truth be told, he rarely was. A rancher with more ghosts than cattle, he'd grown used to watching life pass by without tapping him on the shoulder. That was until he saw her. Not among the horses or the penned calves, but beside them, tied, quite literally, to one. A girl, maybe 19. Her hair was long, dark, tangled with dust and wind. A rope was looped around her wrist, not tight but present enough to say, "She's not here of her own choosing." The man standing beside her, reeking of whiskey and resentment, was slurring words about selling both burdens for cheap, the half-starved mare and the deaf, dumb girl. His voice carried, loud and careless, like someone tossing empty bottles into a canyon. Silas didn't react, not outwardly. Years of solitude had taught him to keep his face still like pond water under fog, but inside something shifted. She didn't cry, didn't plead, she didn't even lift her head. But just as Silas turned to walk away, because that's what he always did, she did something unexpected. She looked up. It was brief. A single glance through the curtain of her hair, but it hit him harder than any storm had ever managed. Her eyes weren't asking for help. They weren't desperate or accusing. They were simply present, entirely, painfully, quietly present. And in that silence he saw her. Or maybe, for the first time in a long while, he saw someone who also saw him. No one asked her name. No one asked where she was from. That part apparently didn't matter. The bidding began. A few grunts, a couple laughs, no one serious. Then Silas raised his hand. He didn't speak. He just nodded once firmly. It was done, just like that. He walked away with a rope in his hand, one end tied to a thin mare, the other to a girl who hadn't made a sound. But what he really took home that day was something he couldn't explain, not even to himself. A presence, a question, perhaps even the start of an answer he didn't know he'd been waiting for. The ride home had been quiet, and not in the uneasy kind of way, just still. The kind of quiet that let wind brush over shoulders and time move without hurrying. Silas didn't speak, and the girl didn't try. She walked beside the mare, rope loose around her wrist, eyes forward, as if this was not the end of something, but the start. When they reached the ranch, dusk had begun to settle like dust over everything. Barn, porch, fence posts leaning from years of weather. He led the mare to the stall and motioned toward the small cabin without looking back. The girl followed, silent as wind threading through old wood. The first thing she did was kneel by the hearth, not to rest, to start a fire. Silas watched from the corner of his eye, pretending to untangle saddle straps. She didn't fumble. The flint struck true. Dry kindling caught. A small flame rose steady, not rushed. She moved like someone who had done this before, not here but somewhere, enough to make it feel like she belonged. The next morning, the coffee pot was already warming when Silas woke. The kitchen table had been cleared of dust. Not scrubbed, not polished, just touched, rearranged in subtle ways that told him someone had noticed where things were and where they ought to be. He never saw her take notes, never saw her ask questions. But somehow she learned the rhythms of the ranch. The mare was fed before first light. The kettle steamed just as the sun peeked through the slats of the window. Even the dog, usually wary of strangers, rested his head beside her knee by the second day. She didn't talk, didn't try, and that strangely brought comfort. Silas had known too many people who filled silence with noise as if afraid of what might surface in the stillness. But not her. Her quiet wasn't absence, it was presence. Like a low fire warming the bones of a cold room. He began leaving small clues, an extra pair of gloves by the door, a coat hook hung lower on the wall. She noticed every one of them, not with thanks, just with use. It was enough. They never spoke, but the days unfolded like pages of a book neither of them needed to write. It was as if the house, long untouched by softness, was slowly remembering how to hold warmth again, not from heat, but from understanding. The sky had changed in a way only ranchers truly notice, too quickly, too silently. The kind of change that didn't come with thunder yet, but with stillness. Animals shifted uneasily. The mare pawed at the dirt and the dog refused to leave the porch. Silas had his head buried in the feed bin, fixing a latch. The wind wasn't strong yet, but the air had weight, heavy and electric. He didn't hear her approach. He never did. One moment he was crouched in the stall, the next she was gripping his arm. Not tight, just enough. She looked at him, not pleading, just urgent. Then she pointed, one sharp motion, and pulled him by the sleeve. He followed, confused, his mind still tangled in tools and chores. But her body moved with certainty, not panic. They had barely cleared the stall when it happened. A blinding white flash ripped through the sky, followed instantly by the roar of thunder that cracked the heavens wide open. The oak beside the barn exploded in a burst of splinters, its branches raining down like angry fire. The ground shook beneath their feet. Smoke and scorched bark filled the air. Silas dropped to one knee, more from shock than fear. Emmeline stood beside him, one hand resting on his shoulder, not trembling, not frantic, just still. Back in the house, the storm howled against the windows. Rain lashed sideways, but inside it was eerily calm. She stood by the table, holding a ceramic mug with a thin crack that had never mattered before. Her fingers traced the fracture slowly. Then she looked at him, really looked, as if seeing something behind his eyes, past the stunned silence, past the man still trying to understand what had just happened. He didn't ask how she knew, didn't ask how a deaf girl could sense lightning before it struck, but something inside him shifted. Maybe she didn't hear in the way others expected. Maybe she wasn't missing sound at all, just attuned to another kind of language, a vibration in the air, a silence that meant more. A heart beats hesitation before the world breaks open. Silas sat across from her and found himself wondering, not for the first time, what else had he been too loud to notice all these years? What else had she already heard, simply by listening without needing to speak? It was the kind of afternoon that passed unnoticed, gray but not stormy, quiet but not heavy. Silas had spent the morning mending the fence where the wind had lifted a board loose. The girl had stayed inside, her movements soft as always, more felt than heard. When he came in, the fire was already going. The dog lay curled near the hearth, and the kettle murmured a low simmer. He set his gloves on the windowsill and wiped his boots, but paused when he saw her. She stood at the shelf near the back wall, where no one ever stood. It was where he kept things not because they were valuable, but because he hadn't yet found the courage to put them away. A rusted belt buckle, an old pair of spectacles, and a single photograph cracked at the corners tucked behind a brass candle holder. She had found it. The picture showed a man younger than Silas, straighter in the shoulders, a hand resting on the head of a boy, Silas himself, maybe 7 or 8. The man was smiling barely. The boy was not. Emmeline didn't ask, didn't point. She only picked up the frame, looked at it for a long, quiet minute, then turned slowly toward him. Their eyes met. And then she did something small, so small it might have been missed by anyone else. She stepped forward and placed her hand over his chest. Not hard, not to stop anything, just there, just enough. Silas didn't speak. He couldn't. His breath caught halfway, and then gave out in a kind of sigh that sounded too close to a sob. No one had touched him like that in years. Not since before his father left. Not since the day he'd buried that photo behind chores and cattle and quiet. He sat down, because his knees wouldn't hold him any more, and covered his face with his hands. Not from shame, not from pain, but from the overwhelming weight of being seen without being questioned. She stayed there beside him. No words, no need. In that stillness he remembered how long he had carried that silent wound, the guilt, the fury, the ache of being a boy raised by absence and raised to repeat it. And somehow this girl, who had never heard his voice, never read a single page of his past, knew. At first it was curiosity. Just glances through windows, murmurs passed over fence posts. The kind of small-town watching that came with any new arrival. But this wasn't just any newcomer. This was a girl who didn't speak, who moved through the market without asking prices, who seemed to know when a horse was about to buck before it twitched its flank. And she lived with Silas, alone. The questions started as concern, then turned into suspicion, then something darker. Did you see how she watches people, doesn't blink? She's not right, not normal. I heard she can hear thoughts, even ones you're not saying. Of course, she hadn't done anything strange, not really. No spells, no shouting, no signs of madness. But in a town where silence was often mistaken for guilt, and difference was a threat dressed in unfamiliar clothes, she didn't need to. Her quiet unsettled them. The way she stood still when others rushed. The way she looked, really looked, without flinching. The way she seemed to understand what someone felt before they even spoke. And when one man muttered, "We want her gone, that girl hears things she ought not," no one argued. But no one agreed either. They just let the words sit in the air, thick with discomfort. Silas didn't confront them. He didn't stomp into the saloon or demand they show respect. That wasn't his way. He simply continued, walking beside her in town, letting her choose seed for the garden, nodding to neighbors without apology. He didn't defend her with speeches. He defended her by staying close. Sometimes that's all it takes to quiet a rumor, not outrage, not denial, just choosing not to walk away. But the truth was they were scared. Not of her, but of what she revealed. Because if a girl who couldn't hear could still understand their fears, their grief, their loneliness, then what excuse did they have for missing it in one another? What if the silence they mocked was the very thing they needed? And what if the one they whispered about was the only one truly listening? By the third week, fewer glances. The fence had been leaning for weeks. A windstorm from the north had loosened its spine, and Silas finally gave in to the day's work. Hammer in one hand, rail balanced in the other, he was 3 nails deep when the board splintered unexpectedly, and the hammerhead caught him across the forearm. He didn't cry out, didn't need to. The pain bloomed sharp and fast but familiar. Blood came in a thin stream, trickling down the grain of his skin like a forgotten riverbed. Emmeline appeared minutes later, not rushed but present. Always that present, she didn't bring cloth or water right away. Instead, she knelt down beside him on the dry grass, knees brushing the dirt. Her gaze went not to the wound but to his face first, watching, measuring. Not the injury, but the man behind it. Silas braced for fuss, for flinching, for something he wouldn't know how to accept, but she only looked, long enough for the sting in his arm to dull under something softer. Then she reached out and placed her hand gently over the gash, not pressing, not cleaning, just resting there, as if her palm might carry some kind of quiet permission to hurt, to stop pretending, to let go. His breath caught, and when it came again, it felt different. When they returned inside, he reached for the notebook he rarely used, not because he had nothing to say, but because he'd long believed no one wanted to hear. He wrote slowly, his hand trembling slightly, not from pain, but from the weight of saying something real. "I want to hear your heart, if you'll let me listen with mine." He slid the note across the table, then sat back, unsure of everything except that he meant every word. Emmeline read it, not once but twice, and then without drama, without ceremony, she smiled. Not a smile of thanks, not of politeness, but of something deeper, like sunrise, like memory, like an answer to a question he didn't know he'd asked aloud. In that moment, something passed between them, wordless, unseen, but lasting. Not love, perhaps, not yet, but a beginning, a door opening. And for a man who had lived most of his life on the outside of everything, that was more than enough. It began with the horses. Children from nearby farms would linger by the fence when their parents came to trade or talk. At first, they were shy around the girl who never spoke. But then they noticed how the animals acted around her, how even the jumpiest mare lowered its head, how the restless dog from the Tanner place lay calmly at her feet. One morning a boy named Eli, no more than 10, all elbows and energy, asked, "How'd you make her stop kicking?" Emmeline didn't answer. She simply knelt beside the animal and placed a hand on its flank, then gestured for Eli to listen. Not with his ears, with his eyes. She pointed to the rise and fall of the belly, the rhythm of breath. Then to the slight flick of an ear, the shift of weight in the back leg. She mimicked it in her own posture, soft, patient, without force. The boy followed. The mare didn't flinch. Word spread the way it always does in small places, not shouted, but carried in low tones across church steps and store counters. She's got a way with creatures. They settle near her, like they trust she won't rush them. Before long, others came, not just children. A mother with a baby who cried too much, a widower who hadn't slept since harvest, a boy who hadn't spoken since his brother left. They didn't come with big questions, they came to sit, and Emmeline never asked why they were there. She simply offered space, a chair on the porch, a cup of warm water with herbs from the garden, a steady presence. They spoke sometimes. Sometimes they didn't. Either way, when they left, they were a little quieter, a little lighter. No one quite understood how she knew what to do, or why her silence felt more comforting than words ever could. But they stopped needing explanations. Because when something works not perfectly but purely, you stop dissecting it. You just return to it. And in time, the town did just that, returning to the girl who taught without teaching, who calmed without curring, who listened without listening. And in doing so, they discovered something they hadn't. It came not with thunder, but with tension, a pressure in the air that made leaves turn belly up and the barn doors shudder before a single gust arrived. Animals sensed it first, hens silent, cattle pressing close to one another, the dog pacing the porch in circles. Emmeline paused mid-step by the water trough. She lifted her face to the windless sky and closed her eyes. Then she turned, deliberate, certain, and looked straight at Silas across the yard. No words, just that look. And this time he didn't hesitate. He dropped the rake, grabbed the lantern, and headed straight for the barn. No need to ask, no second guessing. If she felt something was coming, it was. Together they moved, securing latches, pulling ropes tight, guiding the mare into the center stall. Silas barked instructions out of habit, but she already knew what needed doing. By the time the wind truly arrived, they were back at the cabin, hands raw, shirts damp with sweat, breath ragged not from panic but from pace. The first blast of wind slammed into the porch like a body. Then rain, sharp and wild, hissed sideways across the windows. Silas reached for the latch just as the back door began to groan. Emmeline was already there, shoulder braced, arms steady. They held it shut together, muscles taut against nature's insistence. For a moment the house creaked as if deciding whether to hold. And it did. Inside, light flickered, low and golden. Wind howled outside, but something had changed. There was no fear this time, just motion, just breath. And when the door finally stayed put, when the worst had passed, they didn't move apart. They stood shoulder to shoulder, backs against the wood, hands resting quietly at their sides, breathing in sync. Then Emmeline turned and looked at him, not with thanks, not with relief, but with something deeper, recognition. Not "you saved me," not "I saved you." Just this: we stood, together. For a man who'd lived years protecting only himself, it wasn't sudden. Real change never is. But it came quietly, like fog rolling in over the hills, soft and barely noticed until it was everywhere. At first the stares faded. Then, one by one, the glances turned into nods. Small ones, almost imperceptible. A woman lifting her chin slightly as she passed Emmeline near the mercantile. A man pausing just long enough to hold her gaze, then tipping his hat with no words exchanged. Children were braver. They wave with both hands, sometimes running up just to stand near her, as if silence itself had become something they trusted. One boy boasted, "She taught me how to tell when my dog's sad," and another said, "I can hear wind with my skin now." They didn't need proof. They had presence. Emmeline never claimed to teach. She never corrected or explained. But she offered what no one else had, a different kind of listening. One that didn't rush, didn't fill the air with fixes or apologies. And the town, perhaps without realizing it, began to mirror her. Fewer raised voices in the square, more pauses between words. Even the preacher, who once whispered about demons and strange gifts, invited her to tend the garden behind the chapel. He didn't say it aloud, but his smile when she returned each week was enough. The most surprising moment came from old Mr. Caldwell. He'd been the loudest critic early on. Always had a scowl ready and a story about how things used to be. But one afternoon, he came to the porch with a folded piece of paper in his trembling hand. Emmeline opened it slowly. Scrawled in crooked letters were 6 simple words: "Thank you for not walking away." She looked up. He wasn't crying. He wasn't smiling. But he stayed long enough to hold her hand just once, and that was everything. The town hadn't just accepted her. Winter arrived with less announcement than usual. No sudden frost, no storm, just cooler mornings, wood smoke curling from chimneys, and the slow hush that blanketed the fields by sundown. On one such evening the porch creaked beneath the weight of time, not tension. Silas sat in his usual chair, legs stretched out, boots worn to the shape of his days. Emmeline sat beside him, a blanket draped across both laps, her hand resting near his, fingers grazing but not clasped. They didn't need words to know what the day had held. Fixing a stubborn gate, watching the crows circle high above the barn, Emmeline sketching circles in the frost on the window while Silas stirred the stew. It was in these little moments, these shared silences, that their bond had grown roots. Quiet, deep, immovable. The sun was setting now, washing the prairie in gold. And just as it dipped behind the last ridge, Emmeline turned her face toward him. Her lips parted, not wide, not loud, but with intention. "I don't need sound," she whispered, "only you." Her voice was hoarse, unused, like a forgotten instrument rediscovered. But it carried more than any shouted vow. It was a sentence made from trust, from years of unsaid things finally finding a home. Silas didn't speak. Instead, he reached over and took her hand, not urgently, just fully, as if he'd been waiting not for those exact words but for something like them from someone exactly like her. Their eyes met and held. In that gaze was every mile they'd traveled separately and every moment they'd now walked together. No vows exchanged, no promises made, just presence. The porch creaked again as wind moved gently across the yard. Somewhere far off a coyote called, but neither stirred. They didn't need to, because what they had wasn't loud, wasn't fast, wasn't even easily understood by the world. It was steady, and kind, and true. And as the night deepened, the lantern flickered beside them, casting shadows that danced without sound. mirroring the love between a man who'd long stopped hoping to be heard and a woman who had always known how to listen. Their story didn't end here, because some love stories don't end. They simply continue, quietly, gently, in every glance, in every shared silence, in every